So let's read from Brian Westbury over at First Trust. Repo Turmoil. Been hearing a lot of people commenting about why you don't think we're in a recession. You don't think it's going doom and gloom. And what would happen if the Fed didn't bail out the banks? You would be able to take money from your ATM. For the love of me, man. It's like people live. I literally think people have this need to have fear mongering. It's an odd trait, actually. You know, we say Pollyannish is you could be, what's the word I'm looking for? Overly optimistic, Pollyannish, essentially. Like you don't see the bad, you only see the good. But there's I don't even know what the opposite of that is. Fear-mongering, apopolitical, whatever that is. I can't pronounce the word. But anyway, I'm from Maine. So anyway, I just think there's another, probably even a more of a trend where people have this need to always be seeing negatives and being in fear of something. It's actually sad. All right, so let's read this. In Ronald Reagan's famous A Time for Choosing speech in 1964, he said, "The more plans fail, the more the planners plan." We were reminded of this recently after pundits freaked out when they freak out. Remember that song? That was actually a pretty good 70s song. We were reminded of this when the pundits freaked out when the New York Fed injected reserves onto the banking system to keep some short-term rates from rising. A few things to keep in mind. The jump in the overnight repo and federal funds rates was at the tail of the market. Most trading in the market was normal, with average rates rising just a little, but some small amount of trading went off at a higher bid. In other words, this was not a serious system-wide shortage of reserves. The reason most trading saw little impact is because there are $1.4 trillion of excess reserves in the banking system. You are going to be able to go to the ATM and take your money out. So contrary to much of the press coverage of the issue, the New York Fed repo operations were not due to a shortage of reserves. There is $1.4 trillion in the bank excess reserves. The actual amount of reserve operations, somewhere between 45 and 75 billion per day, is well below the level of daily trading in reserves in previous decades. During the 1990s, for example, 150 to 200 billion in federal funds traded each day. In the 2000s, it went above 300 billion. The recent turmoil is because two things have changed since 2008 that have created new problems for the banking system and the Fed. First, the Federal Reserve Board decided to stop managing policy like it used to. Second, new banking regulations have created liquidity problems in the banking system, even when the banks have ample capital, liquidity, and profits. So let me read that again. New regulations have created liquidity problems in the banking system, even when banks have ample capital, liquidity, and profits. Almost reminds me of mark-to-market. You might have a significantly booming business, but because the value of your car wash shops are going down in value for some ungodly reason, we are going to make you call those loans. We're going to call those loans and make them bring them. And someone right there named Mr. Pablo is dropping big old bombs, which means I got to police. Whoa, that's nasty. I got to police that up. And all right, but we'll read that in a second. All right. Central banks used to add and subtract reserves in order to stabilize overnight rates. Now central banks globally have injected massive amounts of excess reserves into the system in an attempt to manage those reserves by moving interest rates directly. Hold on a second, buddy. Let me get this up. There we go. And you are witnessing me via audio picking up some dog poop. There you go. And you should do the same. All right. Excess reserves are potential money supply growth, and the Fed believes it can simply pay banks to hold those reserves, avoiding inflation. In Europe and Japan, central banks are trying to use negative rates to force banks to lend. In other words, central banks have upped their influence over the banking system through control of even more assets. What does that remind you? Force banks to lend. Again, the old monetary school would be, if we can just open up the floodgates of easy money, people will start borrowing, and borrowing will increase the velocity of money, will increase the increase inflation, increase productivity, increase job growth, blah, 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 blah. The big thing they overlook is if there's no lenders, all right? People are still paying down debt. This is exactly what my man macroeconomics, the holy grail, Richard Koo talks about. You can lend all day, but you don't have any borrowers, so you can freaking lend. You can have zero interest rates and lend, but there's no borrowers to take that side of the trade. All the lending in the world ain't gonna do crap. it's not going to do crap. And so you're going to have all this excess reserves sitting in the banking system, which just sits there, not increasing the velocity of money, not getting it out of the economy, not increasing jobs, not increasing inflation, not increasing anything, because people are saying, I don't want to be stuck like I was in 2007 and 8. At the same time, post-2008 banking regulations have handcuffed banks in significant ways. So the Fed has increased the liquidity out there. $1.4 trillion of liquid cash is sitting in banks' reserves. There is no lenders. The Feds are begging people to borrow. They're saying, banks, get out there and loan money. And the lenders, the borrowers are saying, screw that. At the same time, central banks have injected massive reserves, but they then offset this by forcing banks to comply with the liquidity coverage ratios, the LCR, which forces banks to hold enough liquidity to last a month in a significant financial and economic crisis scenario where unemployment climbs roughly to 10%. The result, in spite of the excess reserves in the systems, banks can still run into liquidity problems even when they're in great financial shape, because they have to keep these LCRs, these liquidity coverage ratios. So the banks are demanding, or the Fed's demanding banks lend. Banks are saying, we'd love to lend, but there's no borrowers. The Fed's saying, we're going to keep interest rates low to basically make it cheap money for you to lend. The bank's saying, we'd love to do that, but there's no borrowers. And on top of that, the Fed's saying, but don't lend too much, because you need to have these LCRs, liquidity ratio, in order to make sure that you can meet a need if we have a 10% unemployment. This leaves the Fed with a dilemma. Will they relax these overly strict rules, even during short periods of stress? Or will they use the repo craziness of recent weeks to justify even more quantitative easing? Oh, boy. Jerome Powell at his press conference on September said, I think if we concluded that we needed to raise the level of required reserves for banks to meet the LCR, we'd probably raise the level of reserves rather than lower the LCR. So he's basically saying we're going to require banks to have more reserves on the side as opposed to lowering the liquidity coverage ratios. So once the planners fail, they end up planning and micromanaging even more. Student loan problems and the government's role in subprime loans suggest this isn't a great idea. And I would add, suggest, which says there's probably going to be some big chaos coming down the pike if they don't freaking pick it out of themselves. Does that mean recession? No. It just means if you need a quick influx of cash to pay off a debt, a loan that's been called because a bank needs to increase their LCR and they can't loan that cash out, who knows what? I mean, literally no one knows. The idea, though, that there's a recession imminent because of this is silly. The issue is what's going to happen is more and more government, more and more lower interest rates, I think, to get people to borrow. And you're like, dude, I don't want to borrow. I don't want to. I don't want to be stuck like I was in 2008 where I had no liquidity and I had all this debt and they called it back on me. You're playing a fool's game if you think that's not going to happen again, my friends. Well, I'm going to borrow at 0% and invest at 10%. I'll be rich. Yeah, and then that 10% thing falls 20% in value, and all of a sudden your bank is calling you, margining it, calling their loan back in. You're in a world of hurt. Don't be that person. All right, we'll see you.